Welcome and thanks for joining me for lesson number 4 of this series from the topic Insights for Surviving FCS or Forced Confinement Situation. The big question for today is, what impact has the forced confinement situation had on your marriage? And in a few months, marital researchers will be administrating surveys over the next 2 or 3 years to gather and analyze the results of the effect of the FCS on various aspects of married life. And so this morning I want to ask you, how has this situation affected your marriage? Which description that I'm going to mention best describe the impact of the FCS on your marriage? A, greatly strengthen your marriage. B, somewhat strengthen your marriage. C, somewhat weaken your marriage. D, greatly weaken your marriage. Or E, no noticeable impact. So, how has the FCS affected your marriage? There are 5 options. A, greatly strengthen your marriage. B, somewhat strengthen your marriage. C, somewhat weaken your marriage. D, greatly weaken your marriage. Or E, no noticeable impact. For my marriage, I would say it has been B, somewhat strengthen our marriage. Diane and I have utilized our time productively. We have discussed these various insights, among others, and have utilized them to enhance our marital relationship. And so, again, I would say it has been B, somewhat strengthen our marital relationship. Again, my objective in today's lesson is twofold. First, to give you 2 additional insights for how to survive an FCS, and to give you 2 additional insights or exercises to implement to strengthen your marital relationship. Up to this point, I have given you 6 insights for surviving FCS. Those insights have been, number 1, be willing to change or adapt or adjust. Number 2, be willing to laugh or simply smile more. Number 3, be willing to think before you speak. Number 4, be willing to view your marriage as a blessing from God. Number 5, be willing to forgive or to let go. And number 6, be willing to be selfless in your marriage. These are the 6 insights that I have given you up to this point on how to survive FCS. Today I'm going to give you number 7 and 8. So let's start with number 7. Number 7, be willing to avoid certain behaviors. Be willing to avoid certain behaviors. You see, in all marriages there are certain behaviors which need to be avoided. There are some behaviors that can cause the marital satisfaction or the marital relationship to experience what I'm calling progressive daily slide. Progressive daily slide. This slide is when something or some things have occurred and keep reoccurring in the marriage. It keeps reoccurring that one of both spouses, they're seriously hurt or wounded. And as a result of their hurts or wounds, their love or commitment to the marriage declines. And over time, they get to the point that they just can't take anymore, and they want to get out of the marriage. So, to avoid what I'm calling a progressive daily slide, where marital satisfaction continues to decline over a period of time, that you get to the point where you say, I just can't take anymore. I want to get out of this marriage, and I don't care about what others say are the consequences. You just want to get out of the marriage. And so there are some behaviors that you need to avoid that will put your marriage in what is known as a progressive daily slide. So, what are some behaviors? What are some behaviors that you need to avoid? Well, I'm going to mention 6, and I want you to think about each one of these carefully. There are many others that I don't have time to mention, but let me mention 6 behaviors that you need to avoid in a marriage. Because if these behaviors exist, they can put your marriage in what is known as a progressive daily slide, where your marital satisfaction on a daily basis declines to a point where one day you get to this point where you say, I can't take anymore, and you want to get out of the marriage. The first behavior that you need to avoid, and that is verbal abusing one another. Verbal abuse. This is simply saying painful words. Words hurt. Name calling, yelling, belittling one another, degrading one another. These are things you need to avoid. These are verbal abuses methods that spouses need to avoid. Physical wounds heal, but it's hard to forget words that are said. And over my years as a counselor, spouses have said to me they'd rather be physically abused than verbally abused. And so remember insight number 3. Remember insight number 3 simply says this: be willing to think before you speak. To avoid verbal abuse, think before you speak. So the first behavior to avoid is verbal abuse. The second is physical abuse or aggressive behavior. Spouses must avoid any form of physical abuse. There is never, let me say it again, there's never a justifiable reason to hit, to slap, to push, or to grab your spouse. When spouses feel frightened or intimidated in a marriage, they need to get professional help. And so, if you want to avoid a progressive daily slide, avoid physical abuse. If you want your marriage to avoid getting to the point where marital satisfaction declines on a daily basis, to one or both spouses will get to the point, I can't take anymore, avoid physical abuse. Number 3, lying or dishonesty. Lying or dishonesty. Be honest. Be faithful. Be truthful in your marriage. Lying and unfaithfulness destroys trust in a marriage. When you don't have trust in a marriage, then you avoid one of the most important ingredients and the foundation of a healthy marriage. In my opinion, trust is more important than love. Trust, in my opinion, is more important than love in keeping a marriage together. When there's little or no trust in a marriage, it is essential to get help. One way of telling that there's a trust problem in your marriage is when one or both spouses feel the need to check the phone of the others without his or her approval or knowledge. There's a trust problem in your marriage when you feel the need to go through your spouse's telephone without his or her knowledge or approval. You have a trust problem. When you don't have trust, then you have an unhealthy marriage. So avoid lying, avoid dishonesty in your marriage. A fourth behavior to avoid is garbage dumping. Garbage dumping. Garbage dumping is simply keep bringing up mistakes of the past. It's keep bringing up stuff that happened 5, 10, 15, 30 years ago. Let them go. Remember insight number 5? Says a healthy marriage is when spouses are willing to forgive and let go. A sign of a healthy marriage is when spouses live in the present and they don't constantly bring up the past. And so avoid the behavior of garbage dumping. Constantly bring up something that the spouse said or did years or months ago. So, number 4, garbage dumping. Avoid it. Number 5, giving an ultimatum. Giving an ultimatum. An ultimatum is a non-negotiable demand. It simply says, you do this or else. Avoid it. Avoid giving your spouse an ultimate demand, ultimatum. Because an ultimatum is dirty fighting. It is dirty fighting. And you're going to have disagreements in your marriage. All marriages have disagreements. You're going to have, so to speak, a fight. And so learn to fight fair. And dirty fighting is giving a spouse an ultimatum. You do this or else is dirty fighting. But fighting fair is giving a spouse an opportunity to express his or her thoughts about an issue in the marriage, about a problem. Be willing to listen. That's fair fighting. It's listen to the other person's point of view about an issue or problem in the marriage. We call that fair fighting. But dirty fighting is giving an ultimatum. Avoid it. Because if you give an ultimatum, guess what is going to follow? A counter ultimatum. Then you do this or else. And that's non-productive in a marriage. And finally, number 6, having unrealistic expectations. Having unrealistic expectations. It's great to have expectations in a marriage, but they need to be realistic expectations. Believe this or not, there are no perfect husbands or wives. Let me say that again. There are no perfect husbands or wives. No spouse can deliver perfection. Remember, your spouse is not you. Your spouse is not you and cannot do things in the exact way that you want things to be done. That's unrealistic. Be realistic when it comes to marital expectations, or you'll make yourself and your spouse miserable. Well, these are just several of many destructive behaviors that must be avoided in a marriage. Not only during FCS, during your forced confinement situation, but they need to be avoided at all times. These destructive behaviors can lead to what is called progressive daily slide. So if you want to avoid what is called a progressive daily slide, where marital satisfaction declines over each day over a period of time, that a spouse would get to the point that he or she says, I can't take anymore, and I want to get out of the marriage. Avoid these destructive behaviors. Now here's the exercise that I want you to implement. Review. Talk about these very destructive behaviors that I mentioned. And then if you can identify one or more, the ones you identify that exist in your marriage, come up with a plan to eradicate it, to alleviate it from your marriage. So again, what I want you to do is reflect over these destructive behaviors. And I'm going to mention them again. Number 1, verbal abuse. Number 2, physical abuse. Number 3, lying or dishonesty. Number 4, garbage dumping. Number 5, giving an ultimatum. Number 6, having unrealistic expectations. These are just a few of destructive behaviors in a marriage that can lead to a progressive daily slide. And I'm requesting that you identify these that exist in your marriage and come up with a plan to alleviate it from your marriage. That's insight number 7. Number 8, be willing to be reflective. Be willing to be reflective. That is to take the time to remember the good times in your marriage. If you want your marriage to be enhanced during this FCS, be reflective. Take the time to remember the good times in your marriage. It's good for spouses every now and then to just remember, to think back when you first got married, to think back when you first fell in love with one another, and remember the good times. You see, to properly appreciate the present, sometimes you need to remember the past. If you're going to appreciate the present, I suggest to you from time to time, you need to reflect over the past. At some time in your relationship, you both were happy. At some time in the marriage, you both were so deeply in love with one another that you just thought you couldn't live without one another. You see, at some time in the relationship, you were at that point that you said, let's get married, and you did. And so remember the times in your marriage when you were deeply in love with one another and you couldn't live without one another. At least you thought you could. Do you remember the first date? Do you remember the first date? Do you remember the first time you kissed one another? Do you remember the first time you kissed? Do you remember who said, I love you first? Who said it first? Do you remember the day of the wedding? Do you remember the wedding night? I bet he does. Do you have a special song about your marriage? So, talk about things that you remember about your marriage when you were deeply in love with one another. The importance of remembrance is seen in the observance of the Lord's Supper as seen in Acts 20 and verse number 7. The Bible goes on to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24 and verse 25, that when we partake of the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine, that we do this in remembrance of Jesus. Christians who neglect to remember what Jesus Christ has done for us greatly increase the probability of the likelihood of falling out of love with the Lord. This is seen in Revelation chapter 2, verse 4. When the Ephesian Christians left their first level of love that they had for the Lord. Thus the Lord had to say to them in verse 5, remember how you used to love me. Remember how you used to be so in love with me before you fell out of love with me. So, remembrance is equally important in marriage as it is in the Christian life. Healthy marriages, strong marriages consist of spouses who take the time to reflect. They take the time to remember the good times, the times when they were so in love with one another, the times when they thought they couldn't live without each other. You see, Satan wants you to forget the good times. Satan wants you to only reflect and concentrate on your present disagreements, everything that's not going right in the marriage from one or both perspectives. And so insight number 7 says if you want your marriage to be great during this FCS, this forced confinement situation, think about when you were deeply in love with one another. Think about when you couldn't live without one another. Be reflective. Remember also, there are some dates. There are some dates or times in a marriage that you don't need to ever forget. For example, your anniversary. Don't ever forget that date. Don't forget her birthday. Don't forget Valentine's Day. And don't forget Mother's Day. These are dates in a marriage that men, you should never forget because they will have an impact on your marital health. And so encourage you. Healthy marriages are marriages where spouses take the time to remember the good times. So here's the exercise for insight number 8. And that is spend 8 to 10 minutes today. 8 to 10 minutes today reminiscing. Reflecting about when you first started dating. Or reflecting over the first year of your marriage. However long ago that was, spend the next 8 to 10 minutes reminiscing when you fell in love or the first year of your marriage. Well, I've shared with you up to this point 8 insights for FCS, for surviving forced confinement situation. Please join me next week, and I give you the final 2 insights for surviving FCS. May God bless you. Until next week.